Okay, so welcome to this talk about Hinduism and Judaism. I appreciate everybody taking an interest in this topic. It's something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, since I started visiting India over 20 years ago, I guess about 20 years ago now. And this is really the first time that I'm kind of putting these ideas out there. I know that I wanted to start with a couple caveats and to say that, I've had these ideas for a long time. I'm sharing them now, but I know that I'm not the first person, in history to ever suggest a connection between Jews and India. In fact, Aristotle is one of the first people who talked about a possible connection. If anyone has their speakers on, if you could just mute them, that would be helpful. The other thing is, I wanted to point out that this lecture is my opinion, and it's conjecture, and it may be true or it may not be true. I'm just proposing some possible scenarios, and I'm not going to be covering everything. There's just no way to cover everything, and I'm sure that some people might feel like, I failed to mention one of the most important things. Originally, I was planning to do a couple lectures. It's just not possible to do everything in one lecture. Um, in terms of the etymologies, the word origins that I talk about, these are what are known in linguistics as folk etymologies. So I want you to know just off the bat that, any self-respecting linguist would reject this because rigorous science demands a progression of words to prove any connection. And because of the antiquity of the things that I'm going to be talking about, that's for the most part impossible. There's just not the records in the numbers that we would need in order to show, even between, Middle English and Modern English, we have only so many records. But I'm going to be talking about periods which are, 4,000 years ago, and we just don't have the records. In terms of the Aryan invasion theory, I want to say that I'm not really going to touch on it a lot. It interests a lot of people. How did Indo-European get into India? And they talk about the Aryan invasion theory. It may be true. It may be partly true. It may be false. I'm not getting into it in this lecture, so I want to point that out as well. And just the last couple things is that I recognize that I may be accused of the sin of what's called diffusionism. In anthropology, this notion that, culture begins in one particular place and then spreads is not very popular. If anything, the idea is that it starts all over and at different periods, but there is no kind of, original civilization. And what I talk about might, to some people sound like diffusionism. And so I want to put that out there. And we're also constantly learning things about the world. Just recently, they realized that people have been going to the Americas, peopling the Americas for now 30,000 years instead of 18,000 years. So science, updates things. And last, but well, I guess two things. One is that I'm trying to build my case in a logical sequence, but it wasn't always possible to do it historically. So sometimes I'm doing this thematically, and I hope it won't be too confusing. At the end, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And the last thing is that I will question deep-seated orthodoxies in this lecture, meaning things that are dear to people about their traditions and their religion. And it's not meant as an attack or a critique of either Hinduism or Judaism, but at times it may provide you a completely different perspective, which you're not used to. So I want to put that out there also right from the beginning. All right, with all those caveats, let's start with this image of Masada. Okay, is everybody still there? I'm just talking. Not if you can hear me. All right, good. I see some thumbs up. Great. All right, so back to Masada. Masada, for those of you who have been to Israel, this is a spectacular UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the place that is famous for being the last stand of the Jews during the first the first revolt against the Romans. We're talking about the end of the first century. And I wanted to read from Josephus. Josephus is the one who tells us about Masada. I wanted to read, it's a little bit long, but I think it's important. I wanted to read a speech. This is the speech of the defenders of Masada by the leader of the defenders. His name is Eleazar. And if you know the story of Masada, what happens is the Romans invade. There's a ramp here on the right. And when they enter, all the Jews are dead. And so Josephus writes a speech about what Eleazar would have told his people as the Romans are, approaching up this ramp the night before, so that, they can decide to commit suicide, which is what he's advocating for. And I'll show you the whole speech here. I'm going to read it quickly, but you can take a look at it as well. And it's from the Jewish War by Josephus Flavius. So, we, therefore, who have been brought up in a discipline of our own, ought to become an example to others of our readiness to die. Yet if we do stand in need of foreigners to support us in this matter of suicide, let us regard those Indians who profess the exercise of philosophy, for these good men do but unwillingly undergo the time of life and look upon it as a necessary servitude, and make haste to let their souls loose from their bodies. Nay, when no misfortune presses them to it, nor drives them upon it, these have such a desire of a life of immortality that they tell other men beforehand that they are about to depart, and nobody hinders them. But everyone thinks them happy men and gives them letters to be carried to their to their familiar friends that are dead. So firmly and certainly do they believe that souls converse with one another in the other world. So when these men have heard all such commands that were to be given them, they deliver their body to the fire, and in order to their getting their soul a separation from the body in the greatest purity, they die in the midst of hymns and commendations made to them. So they die happily in the fire. Okay, so we're talking about, this is, like I said, it's from the first century, from the last stand of Masada. My point in bringing up this passage is to make clear that Indians and Indian practices were widely known in antiquity. In Judea, in the province then, the Jews knew what Indians did, and they knew it because there were connections between these places. And even if this is a fabricated literary device, because Josephus wasn't actually there, um, Eleazar is referring to things that are well known. The things that he's talking about are things like the uh, suicides of gymnosophists. These were Indian ascetics who made their way all the way to Alexandria and Athens, and some of them did exactly this, committed suicide by fire. And also perhaps he's referring to when Alexander invades India, Alexander the Great, and there's a mass suicide in India uh, as his troops enter certain parts of the country. It's what's called in India a jauhar. A jauhar was a mass suicide. So they take inspiration even from the Indians. And this is evidence that people traveled. I don't want to get into all the proofs. There's a lot of proof, archaeological, literary, and linguistic evidence that people moved around a lot more than we think that they did. But the connection between Hindus and Jews, I believe, stretches back at least 2,000 years. But actually, I'm going to talk about even earlier than that. I'm going to go back to the time of Abraham, who is the first Hebrew. Okay? So in this lecture, I'm going to try to cover a bunch of things. And first of all, I'll talk about Hinduism and Judaism and the differences between them in worldview. Secondly, I'll talk about Abraham, the first monotheist. And then I'm going to propose a possible Brahmanic source to Judaism. We'll talk about the world at the time of Abraham, including the Sumerians and the Indus Valley civilization, as well as the Mitanni. And I'm going to try to unpack what I am personally calling the Indo-Semitic cultural zone, and then talk about the temple, Jewish rituals, and then finally look at the relationship between Judaism and Tantra. It's a lot to cover, I recognize that, but we're going to plow through it here. Hopefully it's interesting to you. All right, so let's start with the background on Hinduism, okay? So I wanted to start here. I start with Hinduism primarily because I don't think that there are two religions that would seem more diametrically opposed to one another than Hinduism and Judaism. Hinduism is seen as a polytheistic religion with a myriad of gods. First of all, you have the Trinity, the Trimurti of Brahma here on the left, and then in the middle you've got Vishnu, and on the right side here you have Shiva. I'm reminded once when I was in India in a very rural corner of Odisha, Orisha as they call it, that a person came up to me during a festival. It was a nighttime festival called Shivratri, Shiva's night. And this person saw this one white person in the crowd and he ran up to me very excited and he said to me, "Do you know God?" And I said to him, "Excuse me?" He says, "God, God, do you know God?" I said,
Yes.
"I think I know God." And he looked at me and said, "No, no, God, G-O-D, God." And I said, "Okay, please tell me." And he says to me, G, the generator, O, the operator, D, the destroyer. And that's what we're looking at here in the Trimurti, right? We have here Brahma, who creates, we have Vishnu, who maintains, and we have Shiva, who is destined to destroy the universe. Okay, so G-O-D, God. All right. In addition to this trinity, of course, we have their consorts, right? We're looking here at the Tree Devi, Saraswati, Lakshmi, Durga. Okay, so we have here additional gods. They have the gods and their consorts, and then all the different other gods that we have in India, and I just giving you some examples here of Kartikeya and Ganesha and Vishnu and his 10 avatars, and of course Krishna, and of course I lived in Orissa for a while, so I have to share also, of course, Jagannath on the right over here, Jagannath, Lord of the universe. That's exactly what Jagannath means, Jagannatha, the Lord of the universe, and here he is with his brother and sister, Balabhadra and Subhadra. So we have this kind of plethora of gods. In fact, it's commonly stated in India that there are 33 million gods, or 33 koti deva. Okay. The other thing you can see is that idol making is something that is not frowned upon. It's actually quite common. You have a plethora of gods and you have veneration of idols. You have murtis, as they're called. And you can see here from this temple, or you can see here the Shiva Linga on the left, or you have Meenakshi, the fish-eyed goddess on the right. You have these idols, right, in Hinduism, okay? And so I know that Indians are going to be like, wait a minute, there's Nirguna Ishvara, there is a formless God. I'm not getting into that here. I'm just saying that when you look at Hinduism and Judaism, they seem diametrically opposed, okay? So what about Judaism? Okay, here we have Moses, right, with the tablets. And Moses has the 10 Commandments, right? And the 10 Commandments, even before the Ten Commandments, we should say Abraham is the first, the patriarch. He rejects idol worship and advocates for one God. He's the father of monotheism. And as it says in the very first of the Ten Commandments, says, "I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." So the quintessential even Jewish mantra, which is mandated to be said twice every day and should be the last thing that a Jew utters prior to their death, is what we know as the Shema prayer. And in Hebrew, it's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which in English translates as, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is thy God, the Lord is one." So there appears to be, this appears to leave very little wiggle room. You can go further and say, well, what about, graven images? So the second commandment addresses this question and makes it clear that there's no room for idols, no graven images. It says, "Thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image, nor any manner of likeness. Thou shalt not bow down unto them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God." There's no
Mm,
place for other gods. I'm a jealous God. Notice that God is jealous. It doesn't brook rival gods, and he punishes those who would worship other gods. Okay? And the last thing God prohibits is taking his name in vain in the third commandment. You shouldn't even utter his name, right? He's so holy, that the name shouldn't even be uttered. So this reminds me of one time I was in India, and I remember this group of young men, as often happens in India, they came up to me. They just wanted to, talk to me and, make small talk and where I was from, where are you from, sir? The whole typical thing. And they wanted to ask, how I like India. And of course, as the conversation quickly progressed, they immediately asked me about, what is the name for my God, right? And so I said to them, listen, we don't have a name for a God. We don't call him by his name, at least. We don't utter his name. So they were already very confused. They said to me, they asked the next logical question, which was, what does your God look like? I said, I'm sorry, but we have a God which has no shape whatsoever. So then they said, okay, well, tell me, where is the abode of my God? Where is it located? Where is his mandir? And I said, well, we believe that God is everywhere. So, we don't really have, a mandated place for the God. So now already they were completely confused. They're trying to get to the bottom of this. And they asked me, if there was a main temple somewhere where we worship our God. And I said that there once was a main temple, but it was destroyed thousands of years ago, and we no longer have a temple. So one of them looked at me, out of total frustration, and said, so what do you do? Your God has no name, no abode, no murti, no mandir. What do? Do you pray to a wall? And I said, yes, we pray to a wall. In jest. Obviously, we're not praying to the wall, but he was like completely frustrated. And then finally, one of them noticed that I had a Jewish star, a necklace, and they said, "Ah, okay, you worship Shiva," which made sense to them because Shiva is a god who doesn't care about outward appearances and names, and it just made sense. Okay, I'm just pulling their leg because I worship Shiva, and that was the way it ended. All right. So it was classic example of, how Judaism is, very different from Hinduism. And I want to say that these differences, they have very real world consequences. I'm not getting into, the actual debate about whether Hinduism is really polytheism. That's for a different discussion. I'm talking about the way people perceive it. And I think what's important is that out of Judaism came Christianity and Islam, two monotheistic religions that ruled over India for 1,300 years. And so they obviously, impacted Indian life in many very deep and profound ways. And so, one second. All right. Sorry, somebody is trying to get into Zoom and they're writing me. Let me see if we can get them in. Sorry to stop here in the middle. Nope. Where is the Zoom?
Come on.
No, it is here. Nope, I don't see them. I guess that's just not going to work. We're going to move on. All right. Oh, sorry. All right. So, here's Shiva, who they believe that I was worshiping. All right. So where does this all begin? The Jewish perspective. And we'll begin with Abraham. He's the first monotheist. And let's start with Abraham and try to unpack his story. So who was Abraham? What do we know about him? First of all, we know that he was born in a place called Ur. And you can see on this map on the right side, right bottom, it says Ur over there, Ur of the Chaldees. When he was born, his name was Abram, not Abraham, it was Abram. His father, Terach, took him and his brother Nahor to live in Haran, which is up here in the top of the Euphrates in Syria, in the place called Haran. According to tradition, as a child, he destroyed the idol shop of his father. He married a woman named Sarai. He was directed by God to go to the land of Canaan and promised that land. So Canaan is over here by the Mediterranean Sea, promised that land by God. And then he was renamed Abraham, and Sarai became Sarah. And we know the famous story of how Abraham was going to take his son Isaac to Mount Moriah. And what he was going to do there was going to sacrifice Isaac to God. God requested that he be sacrificed. So he was going to do that on Mount Moriah. Let's try to unpack this story a little bit and see if we can look at it from a different perspective. And I want to do that by looking at the city of Ur. So down here, you see where it says Chaldea. You can see the modern day coastline here, and this is where the coast was at the time of Abraham. It was a major center located at the head of the Persian Gulf. It was a very cosmopolitan city. You can call it an entrepot. That's what we call it in geography, because you have people coming from sea, you have people coming down the rivers, you have people coming overland. It was the largest city in the world at the time that Abraham lived there. And
Really?
it was about a population of some 65,000 is what archaeologists think. Yeah. When he was born, it was the largest city in the world. Right?
Wow.
Today it is landlocked, but at the time it was situated on the coast because the Persian Gulf was 2.5 meters higher then. And it really controlled all of the trade coming in and out of Mesopotamia. Interestingly, when it was excavated in the 1920s, the British archaeologist Wolsey discovered royal tombs in which there were goods from India, lots of them, including 40 seals from the Indus Valley civilization, which was proof of trade. Many things, not only seals, but also lapis lazuli and other things that came from India. So we know that there was a connection between Ur and the Indus Valley civilization. You can see here, this is a reconstruction of the main ziggurat of Ur, just to give you a sense of how large. This is what it looks like today after its excavation. It is a massive structure, and it shows you how big of a city Ur was. So what does
Wow.
what does the name Ur mean? It probably just means city, right? That's why in the Bible it calls it Ur Kasdim, Ur of the Chaldees, because many places were called Ur. Ur Salim, the city of Salim, or of peace, or Shalom, or Shalim, the Canaanite god, whatever you want to call it. Ur Salim is Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Ur Salim. Uruk becomes Iraq today, but it was one of the cities next to Ur. So Ur is what you call a city in Hebrew. To this day, it's similar. We say Ir, right? So Ur, Ir. And we don't know what's interesting about Ur is we don't know what language they spoke in Ur. We know that it was separate from all the other languages in the area. It was not Semitic. It was a language isolate, and that the language came from the East. Okay, it came from the East. Not many options here, actually, but it came from the East. Okay. And interesting, I want to point out that in the Tamil language, the word Ur means your native place. Okay, it means your native place. All right. So Ur, since when does Ur exist? It goes back all the way to the early Bronze Age, and it's one of the most important cities of Sumer or Sumeria. You can see here Sumer, right? And over here you see the Indus River. This is the Indus Valley area. You can see that it's not that far apart. Okay. So the Sumerians are the first known civilization of Mesopotamia and of the Fertile Crescent. It's the oldest civilization in the Fertile Crescent. They date back to about 5,000 BC, so 7,000 years ago, and they called themselves the black-headed people, which means that their hair color was different than the people around them if they were the black-headed one. If anybody of you have ever been to a mass Hindu festival, I think you may know what I'm talking about. They claim that their civilization arrived in Mesopotamia fully formed. And interestingly, when the archaeologists dug down, usually the farther down you dig, the more primitive things become. And in this case, the earliest levels in the area of Sumer, in Ur and Uruk and other places, were actually the most developed. So they came with their civilization fully developed. And we know that they could go back and forth. Thor Heyerdahl in the 1970s built one of his ships and did the trip. And if you've never read his book, The Tigris Expedition, it's a great read. And we also know that in Sumeria, they talk about a place called Melucha. And based on the goods that they received from Melucha, because they had writing and we know what they received, it's probably the Indus Valley civilization. And so considering all of these claims, linguistic and archaeological evidence, it seems likely that the Sumerians were at least in part immigrants or refugees from India, maybe immigrants at first, and then when the Indus River Valley dried up, basically because the Saraswati River dried up, they came as refugees to the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, right, to the Fertile Crescent. So what does that have to do with our friend Abraham? Okay, well, here's also, I forgot to show, Indus Valley Civilization, where it was. You can see Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the two major cities, but there were many other cities. It was quite large, all the way up to the Himalayas. So what does it have to do with Abraham? Here's our friend Abraham. First of all, it establishes a connection with India and Indian culture in Abraham's youth. This is not Hinduism as we know it today, but perhaps some early iteration of what Hindus call Sanatana Dharma. Okay, so this kind of religious duty, this ancient kind of faith. We know that Abraham is reacting to something. He's reacting to idol worship, and we know that that exists in India. And so this way he may perhaps be connected to India. But his name gives us a clue to a connection. His original name when he's born is Abram, not Abraham, meaning father, the father is great or exalted, right? In Hebrew, Ram means great or exalted. And we have many similar names in Jewish tradition like Yoram, Hiram, Amram, Aviram, and even Ramon are names with Ram in them. And the question is, could this be related perhaps to Ram, the god who's connected, one of the avatars of Vishnu? Perhaps in terms of Western scholarship, it wouldn't work, it wouldn't fit the timeline, but based on Indian timelines, it certainly would. But later he changes his name, right? His name is changed to Abraham. And we are told that this refers to his being the father of many nations. And his wife becomes Sarah, from Sarai to Sarah. Interestingly, the braha sound, like that BRH, in Sanskrit has to do with expansion, right? So he's the father of many nations. There's an expansion happening here. And even more interestingly, if you have Abraham and Sarah, and then you look at the Indian gods and you see that you have Brahma and Saraswati, right? You can see that the two are connected. You even have in India a river called the Hakar, which connected to the Saraswati, which sounds a lot like Hagar, right? His concubine, the mother of Ishmael. So you have these kind of names that are kind of repeating themselves. The sounds seem like they might be connected. What does he do with his son? He takes him to Mount Moriah, which is identified with Jerusalem. But interestingly, Moriah echoes the name Meru, right? Meru, or also known as Sumeru. Meru and Sumeru is the mystical mountain, the sacred five-peak mountain of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist cosmology. And it's considered to be the center of all the physical, metaphysical, and spiritual universes, or in other words, the axis of the universe. And perhaps the Sumerians called themselves Sumerians based on Sumeru, which is this mystical mountain of which the entire universe spins around. Right? So perhaps, right? So I propose that Abram becomes Abraham, though for a reason. It's not accidental here. Abram becomes Abraham because he advocates for one God, and that one God which he chooses is the god Brahma. Okay, let me go back here. The god Brahma. With this in mind, I think some things become even more clear. Abraham grew up in an Indic or Indic-inspired civilization, in my opinion, and was opposed to its polytheism. He proposes that only the God of creation, Brahma, be worshipped, since he creates the world. And to this day, that's what Jews worship and believe in. We worship Borei Olam, the creator of the world, of the universe, right? Borei Olam. Brahma is associated with the idea of Brahman, which is discussed extensively in the Vedas. If you think of the god Brahma as the pre-Big Bang existence that is then projected into space, Brahman is the living connection between these things that were in a pre-Big Bang state, and now exist in the reality of the universe. So that kind of mystic connection between them. So while it seems that this would pretty much cover everything and Brahma would be a good god to support, Brahma is actually not worshipped in Hindu tradition. While there are innumerable temples to Shiva and Vishnu, there's really only one major temple to Brahma in Pushkar, Rajasthan. And why is that? Why is Brahma not worshipped? Because traditionally we are told that traditionally we're told it's because he did his job, he finished, and he's not in the picture anymore, right? He created the world. Now Vishnu maintains the world, so we don't need Brahma. And Shiva, of course, we need to worship because he's going to destroy everything in the end. So the operator and the destroyer is the domain that we're in. The past doesn't matter anymore, So we don't need to worship Brahma anymore, and that's why Hindus don't worship Brahma per se, and even more than that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And now I want to jump forward about a millennia and try to connect these ideas together. So, jumping forward a millennia, I want to show you here. This is an image of the city of David. This is Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem. This was a Jebusite city, which became David's capital. And then eventually the temple was built on the top of the hill here. This hill, the top of the hill here, that's Mount Moriah in Jewish tradition, Moriah. It's also the Temple Mount. And it's where Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac before God, stopped him. This place is mentioned in the Bible as being purchased by King David. Who does he purchase it from? He purchases it from a guy named Arauna. Aruna, right? Aruna.
He's an Indian.
Aruna is a Jebusite in the story here. And the place that he purchases the land from becomes the place of the two temples. And it's associated with everything. There's the foundation stone through which all of everything was, created, the whole universe. It's the earth from which Adam and Eve were created at that spot. It's the Garden of Eden. It's Noah's altar. It's the binding of Isaac. Jacob's dream happens here. And of course, Jesus visits several times throughout his life. And even Muhammad goes up to heaven from here. It's like a portal between two universes, right? That's the location that David buys. But who is this? Who are the Jebusites, first of all? And who is this Aruna? So the Jebusites, according to researchers, are a Hurrian people, meaning they come from Haran, where Abraham was born in Ur and then goes to live with his father and brother in Haran. And they're related, the Jebusites, to the Hittites, right? The Hurrian people lived in Syria, Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia. And the most important Hurrian nation, the one which controlled this whole area, are a nation known as the Mitanni. You can see here the Mitanni. And the Mitanni between the Babylonia or Mesopotamia, Canaan and Egypt, and Hatti, which are the Hittites, right? Interestingly, the Mitanni speak the oldest known Indo-European language. The oldest language that is of the Indo-European branch of languages is not Sanskrit. It's Hurrian Mitanni. The names of the rulers and gods are similar to those that exist in Sanskrit. So what does the name Aruna mean? In the Hittite language, it would mean the Lord, right? The name is from the same root as the Indic god Varuna, right? Mentioned in the Vedas, Varuna, right? And also the Greek god Uranus, right? Uranus, the same root, Varuna, Uranus, Aruna, all the same. And probably it has something to do with binding, right? The king Varuna binds the wicked, and Uranus binds the Cyclops. So it's perhaps related to that, or to the notion of verse, which is to drip. And that's where we get the word in modern Hindi, barsa, which is rain, right? So maybe it comes from that root. There's a couple possibilities here. The important thing is, this tells us that exactly at the point when Abraham was in Haran, it was an area that spoke an Indo-European rather than a Semitic language. More than that, it's the oldest Indo-European language in the world, older than Sanskrit. And as we know, a language is not just words that mark things, but they are a product of human culture. So it's worth noting that the names of the Mitanni gods are as follows: Indra, Mitra, Varuna, and Agnis. All of these are word for word the names of Vedic gods mentioned in the Vedas. Hittite was an Indo-European language as well. The Hittites are from Canaan. And then in the land of Israel, David buys this area from the Hittites, this land from the Hittites. You see the Jebusites here in the land of Israel. You see below to the south are Hittites. You have Hittites up to the north. You have Hivites also related to them. All of these are Indo-European speaking people. And we know Abraham buys his own cave where he buries himself and his wife, the cave of Machpelah, also from a Hittite who spoke an Indo-European language, from Ephron Hachiti. And we also know of Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, who is a Hittite and fights for, is in the army of King David. So Hittites were all over this area and they spoke an Indo-European language, okay? Up until now, why is this important? Up until now, we have been led to believe that there can be no connection whatsoever between Semitic languages and Indo-European languages. Yet smack dab in the heart of the Middle East, there is the oldest Indo-European language. To me, it seems ridiculous that the Hittites are everywhere in the land of Israel speaking this Indo-European language, and there's absolutely no connection between it and Semitic languages. But this is important because if you believe that there can be no connection, you won't look for it. Or if you see any similarities, you're going to discount them. So, for example, the oldest holy books in the Indian tradition are called the Vedas, right? Veda means knowledge. In Hebrew, yeda means knowledge. But one should remember that Hebrew words have three-letter roots, and the root for yeda is vav, dalet, ain, vada, very similar to Veda, and they both mean knowledge. If you believe there's no connection between the two languages, then that's just by chance. That has no connection whatsoever. It just happens to sound similar. But if you believe that there could be, then suddenly it changes the picture a bit. Let's take another example. The word for the drug that the gods in Indian tradition used to drink was called soma. In Hebrew, the word for drug is sam. Coincidence? Perhaps. We don't know. We can't prove because we don't have a succession of words. And so linguists discount this as folk etymology and say it's not important. What I'm proposing is an Indo-Semitic cultural zone where these things are actually connected. And I'll give you some more examples of words in a bit. First thing I want to give you some examples of are this water tank over here. Maybe before I get right into that, I check everyone's still there. Yeah, I hope so. I see people waving. Okay, good. All right, we're looking here at a water tank. Okay, this is the oldest water tank in the world, right? This is from the Indus Valley civilization. It's from Mohenjo-Daro, today's Pakistan. Okay, and this is 5,000 years old, which is just amazing in and of itself. We know that this was used for religious purposes because it was directly adjacent to a temple complex. To this day, Hinduism is very concerned with issues of purity and impurity. Hindus regularly perform what they call snan or ritual ablution. The most famous of these, examples is the Kumbh Mela, right? Where people go into the Ganges and they bathe in the Ganges. On the last Kumbh Mela, there were 220 million people bathing within a couple-week period in the Ganges. Unbelievable. All right. Most tanks in India will also have, most temples in India will have water tanks. This is the most beautiful. This is actually from a Sikh temple, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, but it's the same principle, right? People will bathe in the water and it provides ablution, right? So what about Judaism? What happened to Judaism? Judaism is similarly obsessed with questions of purity and pollution. Today, not so much because we don't have the temple anymore. But if you look at traditional Judaism, obsessed with it. give you an example. Jews used to use stone mugs. That's not easy to make, a stone mug, but they had stone mugs because they didn't take in pollution. And so that way they didn't have to worry if somebody else touched it, right? And so they would keep these stone mugs at home, especially in the priestly families. On the left side here, you can see a really big stone basin for water. This is in Cana, where Jesus turns the water into wine, his first miracle. And we know also, like if you go to the temple in Jerusalem, all around the temple, there were dozens and dozens of mikvahs, ritual baths, and not only small ones, big ones as well, like the pool of Siloam and also the pool of Bethesda, where you would go into the water before you go into the temple because you had to bathe, you had to have ritual ablution before you could enter into the temple grounds. So purity and pollution are really important in Jewish tradition, and it's true till this day to some extent, right? Orthodox Jews go regularly to a mikveh. The most ritually defiling thing for Jews is death, right? In Hinduism as well, death is the most ritually defiling. So women go after menstruation and men after spilling the seed. And people every day who are religious, when they wake up, they wash their hands because sleep is 1/60th death. How did you overcome your ritual pollution? Through the burnt ashes of a red heifer, right? We're going to return to this issue of cows later, but cows are also, they play a role in Jewish tradition. The way to become purified of the most defiling type of pollution is through the ashes of a cow. Right? All right. And I mention this also because in Christianity, baptism comes out of the Jewish tradition, right? So we have this, kind of continuous tradition that goes back from, in my opinion, from the Indus Valley civilization to this day. What is the word for pollution in Hinduism? The word is tamas. What's the word in Judaism? Tameh. Something which is impure is tameh. Tamas is one of the three gunas or attributes and shades.
Yeah.
Tamas. Yeah.
That's ignorant.
Ignorant, dark, heavy, polluted. It can be all these things together. And this is one of the gunas. And a guna is kind of like a shade of something, like it's like an aspect or something like that. And in Hebrew, we have a quality, right? And in Hebrew, the word is gavan, which can mean like a hue. So maybe this is another example of just a coincidence of words sounding similar. But it seems weird to me that it would happen again and again on such important issues as well. Let's take a look at the priests of Mohenjo-Daro. I told you it was next to a temple, the water tank. Well, here's what archaeologists found in 1927 on the left side. We have a priest that was discovered. They think at least it was a priest. Very interesting little figurine. You can see it if you ever go, I think it's in Mumbai in a museum there. And you can see he's wearing this beautiful outfit with a trefoil. Maybe this is talking about a trinity, perhaps the trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Who knows? Judaism also has tradition of Trinity, right? Remember in Isaiah, we have this idea of holy, 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 kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. And Christian tradition obviously has this very developed notion of a Trinity. What's interesting for me here is the headband and the armband. And if you look at the headband, look at the backside of the headband. Look at the backside of tefillin in Jewish tradition, right? And look at the little circle up here and on the arm. Of course, for Jews, it would be on the other arm unless you're left-handed. But the idea is, what is going on here? These kind of recurrent kind of, images. And to this day, many Hindus wear talismans on their arms. In the villages where I was, a great many of them wore these little talismans with writing in them on their arms. I'll give you another example from the Indus Valley civilization. This is Pashupati. Pashupati is like, this is seal, which shows, we think, perhaps Shiva. This is, again, from the Indus Valley civilization, thousands of years old, means the Lord of the animals. Pashu can mean kind of soul. So the Lord of the souls, right? In Judaism, the word for an animal soul is nephesh, which is quite similar to pashu. If you think of it, nefesh, nafashu, Pashu, right? It's not that hard to get from one to another. So in both Hinduism and Judaism, there's this notion of kind of like this animal soul, right? And I could go into a big discussion now about the five koshas, and I can talk about Shiva Linga and all these things. I'm not going to do that because we just don't have enough time. But there's a place to talk about all these things because I think they are connected here as well. Let's look at, if we're talking about animals, let's look at sacred cows, at cow worship. Okay, here in the middle we have the Canaanites. This is from Ashkelon. We can see here they have a little uh, the calf that had its own little house that was worshipped. On the right side, we can see from the Pashupati temple in Nepal and Kathmandu, you can see a golden Nandi, a golden bull, right? Because Shiva's steed is a bull. And on the left side, we have the sin of the golden calf, right? So nothing today, I think, could be further from Jewish practice than cow worship. In Hinduism, cow worship is a central tenet, and Shiva's steed Nandi, is also has a pride of place within the pantheon, right? Yet, as Jews, we have this story of a golden calf, evidence that cow worship was widespread at one point, and not only in India. The Jews, after all, could have made a god of, they could have made, a golden anything. They could have made a golden sheep or a golden goat, but they made a golden calf. And so that, I think, is telling in some way. And we know that cows were worshipped throughout this region by the Canaanites, by Minoans, by Egyptians. So I'm saying that there's, this kind of shared culture that goes all the way from one end of Asia to the middle of Asia, to South Asia, where India is. And Canaanites, sacrificed cows, as did Jews in the temple. And as I mentioned, cows would actually um, would purify people of the most extreme impurities. Interestingly, you have this image here. This is an image of the molten sea, what we call in Hebrew Yam Hamutzak. This is at the entrance to the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. You see here 12 bulls, and above it the water that was stored up here. These bulls were, of course, eventually removed during the reform of King Ahaz, but these were here for hundreds of years. People would enter into the temple, and by the side of the main door, you would see these bulls, just like you might today in Kathmandu when you walk into the temple and you see Nandi right at the entrance. The word for cow in Hebrew is para. This is the same root as the word poria, which means, fruitful, or pri, which means a fruit. And you notice how the P becomes F, right? And it shows that these words might be connected again between Indo-European and Semitic. Of course, if you read the Oxford English Dictionary, they'll tell you that there's no connection between these two words, and they find a different derivation. But I think that, this should be considered, and I'll tell you why, because in Hebrew, this notion of pur it has a notion of expansiveness, right? Poriyut, right? Something which, is expansive. And interestingly, in India, pur is also what we call, a city, right? You add it to the ending of a city. And the word fortress may also be coming from the same. But I think that the idea of this expansiveness is exactly what Hindus venerate in cows, right? This ability to give so much: meat, milk, bones, work, fuel, all these things are coming from a cow. And so cow represents this kind of expansiveness. All right, the next thing, if we're talking about temple, I want to talk about temples in the old world. We're talking here about the Temple Mount. On the left side is Solomon's temple. On the right side, you can see, and this is where Herod's temple ends up being built. On the right side, you can see that there's a temple in northern Syria near the border with Turkey. It's called the Ain Dara temple. And it's built in a similar way, right? It's all built, divided up into similar parts, right? And the parts represent different parts of the body. So the Dvir, the inner room, represents a head. All right, the Heichal represents the torso. The Ulam is the area of the legs, and then you have the entrance area where you have the feet, right, with the two columns, kind of representing the feet standing up, right? So you have kind of like a body lying down, right? If you want, here's the temple of Solomon's temple, and to the right you can see the Yama Mutsak with the water coming out. And then here you can see this is showing what I just talked about, but in a schematic way. So you have the head, you've even got the priest cells around the side. Right over here, it's the side of the arms. In the middle of the body, the legs, the feet, all of it together up here, right? So lo and behold, in India, this is exactly the way they build temples. They design their temples along the exact same principle. It's meant to be like a body of somebody lying down, and you can see here with all the different chakras and all the different parts of a Hindu temple. They represent things that are in the body as well. It represents, in a sense, the celestial body, right? The idea being that as it is above, so it is below. Everything is connected and reproduced. Um, so in a sense, it's referring to this kind of idea of the original or cosmic man in Hinduism, which Hindus call Manu, and he has all the souls of everybody in him. And interestingly, in Jewish tradition, Adam also has all the souls in him. He's also the cosmic man. And the pillars are also used in similar ways, right? In Jewish tradition, the pillars have names. And the idea is, in Hindu temples and in Jewish tradition, that they're a connection between heaven and earth. That the pillars connect us between this world and, in Hinduism, you'd say Svarga, right? The world of heaven. The next thing from the temple that I want to talk about, and here you can see, this is on the left, Jagannath Temple, and this is Aindara on the right. Just another example of how similar the two temples really are in their construction. The next thing I want to talk about is something which is hard for people to hear. We'll talk about swastikas. Swastika in Hindu tradition is something very lucky, very auspicious. In Jewish tradition, it may have represented the letter Aleph, right? It's a Kabbalistic symbol. It's the first letter of the alphabet. It's a very important gematria because it equals 1, but its parts equal 26. If you take apart the yud here and the yud there and the vav in the middle, you get 26 in the gematria and the numbering system of Jews. 26 happens to also be the number of God's 4-letter name, yud and hey and vav and hey, right? It adds up to 26, right? So all of these things come together. And here you have representations from Kabbalistic works of Aleph as a swastika. We know that this was an Essene symbol. The Essenes, a secretive sect that are in Qumran. And it appears in many places. You can find it in Ein Gedi, in Capernaum, in El Kanatir, in the Temple Mount, in Magdala, in Sepphoris, in many, many places you have swastikas. And while it's strange to think of it, what we're looking at here is this here on the left side is the Western Wall. And at the very top of the Western Wall, there were swastikas. Today, when you ask archaeologists about this, and there were swastikas in the temple as well. Here, this is the ceiling of the passageway that led into the temple. When you talk to archaeologists today and you ask them about these swastikas, they'll tell you, no, that's just a meander, right? It's just, like a little doodle. I find it really hard to believe that at the top of the temple, that the Jews, the most holy place in all of the world for Jewish people, they said, why don't we put a doodle up there without any thinking or reasoning behind it? So I don't know, maybe it's a doodle, but I find it really difficult to believe. Let's talk a little bit about, temple worship. If you ask people, for example, how often do Jews pray? Well, they'll say, Hindus pray twice a day, Jews 3 times a day, Muslims 5 times a day. When in reality, in the temple and in the Bible as well, you only really have to pray twice, which is exactly like the Hindu prayer, right? Twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, right? If you think about what it says about Shema, the Shema is for the morning and the evening, right? In the temple, there were sacrifices. There was an altar. You can see here they're burning. There was in the tabernacle in the desert and later again in the temple. Animals would be sacrificed and then burnt and eaten after being offered up to God. Very similar to what it talks about in the Vedic tradition. And it's basically the same, structure as ancient Hindu worship, right? You have sacrifice and fire ceremonies, or what we call yajna, yajna in Hindu tradition, or homa today, the little smaller fire. You can see it. It was in the temple. It was very central in the temple in Jerusalem. Another thing that you have in the temple is incense, right? And fire. On the left, you have a puja tray, right? You have the incense sticks. You have a fire. If you ever show up to someone's house, for the first time in India, they'll often do this whole ceremony for you. And if you look at Jewish tradition, if you look at Havdalah, what do you have? You have the fire and you have the incense. Very similar. These things, repeat themselves. And in fact, in the temple in Jerusalem, in order for there to be services, they needed to have a mixture of incense, of spices, including cinnamon and cassia, two spices that could only have arrived from India. And so 3,000 years ago in the temple, they were already doing business and trading and getting things from India, from far away as India, and they needed it. It was essential for services in the temple. Why? Why those things? Similarly, when you go to a Hindu temple, you go barefoot. In the temple, you went barefoot. According to the Mishnah, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the high priest would dress up in the finest clothes that he had, the finest linens. This is in the Mishnah. According to Jewish tradition, the Mishnah is also from God. It's spoken by God. It's what, you would call in Hindu tradition shruti, right? It's heard, but it's from God. It says in the Mishnah that you have to wear a certain type of linens, and those linens are called Hinduya linens. They have to come from India, right? Wow. Solomon sends his ships, another thing, the breastplate that the high priest wears, the stones, some of them could only have come from India. And Solomon sends his ships to India, we know from the Book of Kings, to obtain gold and precious gems and other things like kopi, which is the Tamil word for monkey. Kopi is Hebrew kof. It means monkey, the same word. It comes from there. Okay. Holidays. If we look at holidays, we'll see that many holidays end up being exactly on the same day. Like Holi and Purim are always on the same day. They always fall on the same day, the two holidays. And that's because Jews, unlike Christians and Muslims, Christians have a solar calendar, Muslims have a lunar calendar. Jews and Hindus have a luni-solar calendar. We share a very similar calendar. The only difference is we're both on a 19-year cycle. Our cycle is 3rd, 6th, and 8th, 11th, 14th, and 17th. Theirs is 3rd, 5th, which is different than 6th, and 16th instead of 17th year. They add an extra month. They intercalate a month. So we're on basically the same calendars even. All right. So I'm going to start wrapping up here. And I want to bring us to a discussion, which I hope, this is my proposal here, right? My proposal here is that there is this connection, and I would say that the connection actually is somehow connected to Tantra. We can talk a lot about mystical and Kabbalistic congruences here, but that I think would be a whole other lecture, because there's a whole lot to talk just about that. But I premise this talk on the idea that Abraham chooses Brahma, the creator God, as the one true God, and said that and I also mentioned that Hindus are not very impressed with Brahma because he creates the world, and the hard part is to maintain the world, or the heavy lifting of having to destroy it eventually, right? So obviously this is an oversimplification. Why don't Hindus worship Brahma? Because from a Hindu perspective, Brahma over-identifies with his creation, meaning with the material world that he creates. He creates this material world, but he's never satisfied with it, which prevents him from seeing the real world and becoming spiritual. It causes him to pursue his personal pleasure, or what's known as boga, right? So rather than him pursuing Atma, to surpass nature, he pursues aham and wants to dominate nature, right? If you know, in the Bible, it says, for example, that the goal of people is to rule over nature, right? That would sound very negative from someone who's looking at this from this perspective, right? What I'm arguing here is that the classic Jewish approach to this question is to take a non-binary view of spirit and matter. I would call it something like Advaita Judaism. Advaita Vedanta is a philosophy in Hinduism of non-duality. Judaism certainly sees things in this way and would argue that the role and the goal of the game, so to speak, is to make the material into something spiritual. And this is done through actions which elevate the sparks that are trapped in the matter in order to unite everything with the oneness of the everything, which is God, right? So that's the goal as Jews. We're always trying through the material world to make this material world spiritual, which means that when we're saying the Shema prayer, we don't say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one." One would, like in the only one, that would be, echad, eka in Sanskrit, again, a word which is similar, eka, echad. What we're talking about here, echad means oneness. If we wanted to say the only one, we would say yachid. But that's not what we say. We say echad. We're talking about the oneness of everything. The matter is spiritual. And this world that we live in, the word for world in Hebrew, olam, comes from elam, which means something which is not visible, right? Something which is illusion, right? Something which is unreal, which is what the world is for Hindus as well, right? Maya, or in Hebrew we also say, or in Aramaic, olama de shikra. In this worldview, everything, sex, eating, going to the bathroom, anything can be elevated into a spiritual act. And there are appropriate prayers to say which are related to these things. So the closest thing that I find in the Indian tradition to this way of thinking is Tantra. Tantra means a weave, either, in other words, weaving material and spiritual worlds together. It's an offshoot of Advaita, non-dual philosophies. And the goal is to return us to the ultimate truth, which is divine consciousness of Brahman, that I spoke about earlier. So the divine consciousness of Brahman, if you will. Let me give you an example. Here we're looking at, we've got on the left side the tree of life, which is the Kabbalistic tree of life. On the right, we have the chakras. You can see how they overlap on the body. As it is above, so it is below. These things all connect. They look different slightly, but it's the same kind of ideas in a sense of these connections between the physical, spiritual, and material worlds. But I'll give you a better example. The defining ritual, and I promise we're almost done, the defining ritual of Tantra is what's called the Panchamakara, right? Also known as it's a central ritual, it's the 5 M's. The 5 M's are Madhya, Matsya, Mamsa, Mudra, and Maitunya. These are the 5 M's of Tantra. Madhya means alcohol. Matsya means fish. Mansa means meat. Mudra can mean a gesture, but it can also mean a grain, and that's how it's understood in this context usually, a grain. And maitunya means intercourse or sexual intercourse, right? So if anybody knows anything about Jewish tradition, it might remind you of a couple things here, right? We talked about alcohol, kiddush. We talked about fish. We've got our gefilte fish here. Fish is not accidentally by chance on Shabbat. The word dag in Hebrew in gematria equals 7, which is the 7th day. And it says always, God is likened to a fish, all these kinds of things, because his eyes are always open. It's not just accidentally there, gefilte fish. The same thing with the meat. I put some brisket here. Meat is important on Shabbat because you have an extra soul and you can elevate the spirit, the nafish of the animal, as I mentioned before. You can elevate it. On Shabbat, you're likely to do it, whereas on other days, it could bring you down. You see here a big Hasidic family. It's known. The word chamin, which is, cholent, chamin, some interpret it as cham and min, which means hot and intercourse. And so the Jewish tradition, yeah, Shabbat is a good day for that. And so here we have the classic tantric, you know, ritual. Shabbat ritual is exactly the same. Is that accidental? I mean, if it one or two things were like that, I'd say, you know what, maybe, you know, these things just are the same. But it just seems strange to me that it would be so similar. And so you have to think about what could this be about. And again, I'm just offering one possibility. I may be completely wrong, but I put it out there. In Genesis 25:6, it says that after Sarah dies, Abraham has 6 sons with Keturah, which is, by the way, the word for incense. So the woman who he marries after Sarah's death, her name is Incense. Traditionally, she's seen as Hagar, but we can't be for sure. And it says in that passage, it says, unto the sons of the concubines that Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and he sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. Is the east country India? According to the Jewish tradition, it is. And the gifts that he sent with them were not just mere gifts of stuff, they were gifts of secret knowledge, right? Where do we get this idea that it was knowledge? Well, if you look in the book of Kings, it says in chapter 4, Solomon's wisdom was greater than that of all the men of the East. In other words, he's comparing himself to someone in the East, I suspect India. And they know that they have this kind of connection. And Abraham sends them perhaps as missionaries, right? That's what Aristotle was saying, that they went to India and they became the Brahmins. I don't know if that's true, but the idea is that Abraham provides an out. He says, okay, you guys have this issue with Brahma. I'm going to give you a solution to this kind of contradiction and problem between Prakriti and Purusha, right? This conundrum. And this tradition of Tantra emerges in India. It might or might not be connected. Now, the last thing I'll say is, I don't know, you know, I know that the difference between Jews and Indians is just an iota. This word up top is Hodi, which means Indian. But all I need to do is add a yud, which is an iota, and you get the word Yehudi, which is Jew. And so while it looks like the two religions are really separate and different, perhaps we're not as different as we might think. Oh, there's my card. And I'm going to open up this. I hope you guys are still there and enjoyed it. Let's see if anybody dropped that. We lost one person.
Yeah, because his father is from Argentina. Oh.
Okay. Thank you. I would love to hear any questions that you might have. You just have to
fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much.
You can unmute yourselves if you want. Talk.
That was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad.
אייל, יש לי הערה קטנה או שאלה?
Okay.
I'm sorry, when you spoke about the design of the Hindu temple and the connection between the physical body as perhaps connecting with the spiritual and the connection between heaven and earth. It took me, and I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but it took me to Leonardo and the Vitruvian Man.
Right, right. You saw when I put the image of the temple, I actually put it in a circle because I was also thinking along those lines of the Vitruvian Man. The slide itself, if I get back to it, is also, you see, I put it in a circle with that thought in mind, right?
Oh, okay. Because if I remember correctly, he when he did the Vitruvian Man, it was also related to a design of a church that he was in charge of designing, and he wanted the church to represent those ideals.
Right, right, and that does go from Gothic architecture is very inspired by the temple architecture in Jerusalem. And so there's even been I've seen some documentaries on it on the Discovery Channel. And so there's a connection, I think a continuous connection, that this kind of, like I'm calling it the Endosemitic cultural zone, that along these paths, these trade routes that go all the way from Egypt all the way, and Athens all the way to India, that there was this idea of, temples recreates this cosmic man.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Hi, it's Alan from Iowa. How are you?
Hi, is that Alan?
Yes, hi.
Hi, Alan.
First, I want to tell you it was an excellent lecture. One of the best lectures I've listened to in a long time. I listened to a lot of lectures. I was wondering, is there any, because it opened up more questions than it answered, obviously, which proves that it's a good lecture. Do you have a bibliography of references we could refer to that would give us more reading to delve into some of the questions you raised? And also, are you going to make the recording available? I can share it with my rabbi.
I will be making the recording available. I need to edit it a little bit, so it may take a little while, but yeah, we can talk about that, how to get it to you. I'm building a YouTube channel at the moment, and so I want to do it kind of organized and get a bunch of things out at the same time. In terms of the bibliography, so look, the stuff that I'm talking about are things that I just put together based on, like I said, 20 years of really reading and thinking about it. I can give you a bibliography of works which question the classic kind of Western historical ideas surrounding India, this kind of ideas surrounding the Aryan invasion theory, the ideas about the Indus Valley civilization, and whether the Saraswati River existed or not, and also things that talk about Tantra. A lot of people in the West are scared of the word Tantra. There's some fascinating, excellent books on it, which will give you a whole other perspective.
That would be ideal. And also, what's the first historical reference to Brahma?
In the Vedas. And so, if you want to read about the Vedas, you got to go to the original. And those are...
No, I was thinking...
What's that?
Just answer a question in my mind about timing versus how long before Abraham...
You're breaking up. Alan, I think you're breaking up. You may be... I don't know if you can hear me. You email me, but basically, the question of timeline has a lot to do with the question of the Saraswati River and also the Aryan invasion. And so there are very different timelines based on whether you're looking at it from kind of a Western, classical approach to Indian timelines, or Indian ideas about how old these things are. So Indians would argue that the Vedas are much older than what Westerners would say that they are. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Amit raised his hand. Amit, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you well.
Hear me?
I hear you great.
Okay. Yeah, it was a very nice lecture. Yeah, I liked it. But, there's some things like, Brahma. I think Brahma is, only one temple is there in Pushkar.
Right.
But actually, he did incest, with the goddess Saraswati
Yeah,
is his daughter.
I know Satarupa is his daughter, and then Shiva, all these things I know. I didn't get into that.
But,
some of that actually is
but
interesting and could be related. This notion of how Shiva, forms this kind of man-woman with with Shatarupa, that's very similar to the idea of Adam in Jewish tradition. I don't, this is already a resolution that I think, for the big picture is getting too deep into it.
Also,
I was talking about in general.
Also, Jewish philosophers, they were called Rishonim, right? Rishonim. They were called Rishonim.
Yeah, the
Jewish
Rishonim. Right.
Yeah, and Rishi, the word Rishi in India.
Hey, shall we
Perhaps.
go?
Yeah.
Shall we go?
Yeah, Rishonim, I never thought about that, but that's a great idea to think about it, because Rosh,
Rishi means philosopher.
Rishonim means the first ones. The Rishonim means the first. They are a group of philosophers who were the first in this group of, like in this series of philosophers. Just like you have, you know, in India you have the Mimamsika, right? So you have Purva Mimamsika and you have the Uttara, you know. So the Rishonim will be like the Purva Mimamsika, right? The first ones.
And also, you know, the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva,
Mm.
they represent the aspects of Brahman. You know, Brahman is the
Right.
which you call in Judaism Ein Sof. You know, Ein Sof.
Yeah,
You know,
Ein
when
Sof, sure.
so Ein Sof
Right.
is same as Brahman. When it
Yes.
manifests, it becomes like Hashem. You know, Hashem is having human characteristics also, like justice and all that. We are only giving
Correct.
symbolic representation
I know,
because
and I mean, I hear everything that you're saying,
yeah,
and I would
no, I want
love.
to
I
say
think this would be great to sit and talk with you, and I'll take notes
yeah. I will tell.
and I'll take
I'm
this
also
other
researching like
information.
you. I'm also researching. Yeah, I'm
Also,
also researching like you for a long time.
yeah.
So
Okay. Did somebody else raise their hand? I'm looking here. I know that someone else.
Oh, Al.
Yes.
Hey, Al. How you doing?
Hi, Dylan. Good
So
to
nice
see you.
you. So nice seeing you. Thank you so much. Lecture is fascinating, and obviously this is probably a broader, like, philosophical or other point, and it's not perfect in terms of very obviously traditional Judaism in terms of how to fit it. I'm curious, how do you think? Do you think there are ways that any of this, like what you said, that for a while I think many, at least like modern Orthodox streams, have been talking about the kind of wider Middle Eastern civilization in which the biblical story like kind of takes place in. Do you think that there's a way that this could become more integrated in terms of Jewish knowledge of like a relation to India, or have you thought about that at all in terms of how Jews might process it or think about this? Is it that disruptive? Was it that challenging, or do you think it could actually kind of coexist in some ways with some stuff?
You know, I think honestly, one of the reasons that I haven't really talked so much about this over the last 20 years, you know, not that this is like, you know, Darwin's, you know, discovery of evolution, but I do think that this would be something that there are many Jews who will have a very hard time processing. There'll be a lot of pushback on this notion, and not only Jews. I think you know think about Muslims or Christians and how they see India. They have a very hard time imagining India as anything but this pagan country, and to think that their religions might have come out of a of that milieu, if not exactly in that space, right? Because Abraham is in Sumeria, but out of that milieu, I think there's going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance. If I try to, someone wrote I should write a book. I've been thinking about a book for years, but I also, kind of like, do I really want to put myself into that when, I know that there's going to be a lot of pushback and cognitive dissonance, and like I said, when I gave my caveats at the beginning, I already heard some of these things. Linguists are going to say this, archaeologists are going to say that, everyone's going to say, well, you just, it doesn't work this way. You're piecing all these things together. But I just, I can't imagine that all of this is just entirely coincidence. These correlations, and if they are actually examples of this connection, then we need to look at India in a different way, and we need to look at the civilizations of this area in a different way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. It's a lot, very good, big food for thought.
Okay, great. Anybody else?
Yeah, sorry. Just a thought of asking you.
Yeah.
We always say that Hinduism is a polytheist kind of culture, whereas what I read out of the Bhagavad Gita is that Krishna exposes himself to Arjun as one single God and explains himself as a one single God. Okay, and of course that the explanation very much matches Moses's visuals. There is a different story, but isn't then Hinduism a monotheist culture or
okay, so I personally think that Hindu philosophy and many Hindus are monotheists, first of all. This notion of the three gods, all of this, I like what Shankaracharya, how he described, this idea of Hinduism as being like when you have a rain and you have all these different puddles, right? And the different puddles, you can see the sun in each puddle. That doesn't mean that there's more than one sun. That's just reflections of the one, right? And when they dry up, there's just the sun, right? But it's all reflections of the one. And these names, if you study Hinduism, you see that they're very deep philosophical concepts, right? All of it, Shiva, Vishnu, Krishna, all of these things are very deep in every way, right? It is deep, you know, every little aspect of it. You know, there's layers upon layers of thinking here. And frankly, in Judaism, we have different names for God, right? But we don't think of God as different, right? We have the 4-letter name. We have, you know, Elohim. We have Shin Daled Yud Shaddai, right? We have the Shekhinah, right? The feminine aspect of God. We don't say, well, Judaism is, you know, polytheistic. I think that in the same way that Judaism has these different aspects of God in the world, Hinduism just calls them by different names, right? And they're aspects of godliness, but it doesn't mean that there is no conception of God as oneness or one in Hindu tradition. That said, there are many Hindus out there who are not educated in their own tradition, and they just pray to the idol. And Hindus are aware of this as well, just like there are Buddhists that do this, just like there are, you know, Westerners who pray to money. You know, there's all kinds of, you know, people out there. But I think that at its core, the Hindu philosophy, without a doubt, in my opinion, is monotheistic.
Eyal, can you please say again a few words about the linguistic issue around Haran and why the more traditional linguists don't see any commonalities or refuse to see any commonalities with what you call Indo-Semitic?
Right. So I'm not the first person who's ever tried to see these commonalities.
Right.
There's definitely a school of linguists in Russia who talked about it, and in Germany in the 19th century. And then there's this idea of a nostratic language. Nostra means ours. Today, linguists tend to group Semitic languages with African languages. They call them Afro-Asiatic languages. The reason that they don't connect it to the Indo-European is, like I said, for a linguist to actually show a connection, there need to be two things. One is words that you can show that over time one develops. And so you have, you know, I don't know, you have words that change their meaning over time, and you can follow how that word develops over the centuries. That's one thing. And if you could see the connection there, like, you know, that it borrows this word and it changes at a certain period, then you could say this happened. The other thing that they need to look at is grammatical structure, sort of the substrat of a language, and to see that the grammar is somehow similar. And if they don't see a similarity in the grammar in any way, then there's no connection between two languages, right? But as a rule. I think that because there's so little evidence that it's easy to say, well, there's no connection, and that's the dogma. That becomes the dogma. And the problem is, you know, they take this idea of absence of evidence is evidence of absence.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the way it is in reality, right? Sure, most times, you know, we have this concept in science of Occam's razor, this idea that the simplest answer and solution is the correct one, but it's not always that way, right? And, you know, I'm reminded actually of a story that Tur Heyerdahl mentions in his book, The Ra Expedition. I mentioned the Tigris expedition, but he also did the Ra expeditions, Ra 1 and 2. And he saw a connection between the pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids of the Mayans. And he said, look, you know, these two, for so many reasons, look similar. There must be some kind of historical connection between Egypt and Mesoamerica, Central America. And the critics said to him, you know, that's just by chance, you know, that's just, you know, you're just comparing two things, right? A pyramid, triangle is, you know, the basic, a geometric figure, it's not surprising that the two things would be similar, that would be what they built. So Heyerdahl went and he built a long list. I think it was 67 similarities that he saw between, the Egyptian pharaonic civilization and Mesoamerican civilization. 67 various items. And so the critics said, well, the fact that you could find so many things that are similar prove that there's no connection, right? Because there's so many. It must mean that these things that you're mentioning are things that could be anywhere.
Yeah.
You can't win.
Right. Interesting.
Okay. If one last question? A question is that, Amit, you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Oh, there's
Can you
another
hear me?
person raised their hand too, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you great.
Actually, in Egypt, the Elohim, El was the bull. You see, El is a
Yeah,
bull, and
right,
Nandi is also a bull.
correct.
So that is a link I was thinking.
Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. Okay, and there was someone else raised a hand. You can just speak. Oh, Susanna?
No, I'm okay.
You okay? All
Yeah,
right,
I'm just listening.
all right.
Learning a lot. Thank you so much for doing this. I've been waiting for 20 years. This is new to me. I mean, I've been doing Zoom yoga classes. As I said, I've been sending you private messages. Didn't mean to. I meant to send them on the whole thing. But it's interesting that I just started moving my yoga direction to Yoga Shalom Mission, which is to bring the connection of yoga and Judaism together. I think that
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something. This is definitely what you would call a folk etymology, but it's one that I love.
Well,
and that is that shalom could be read as shalom.
Exactly.
Of om.
Yes.
Sometimes,
exactly.
sometimes, if you ever do the Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after the food, if you read through it, the last word is shalom, right? And so it's always nice to end shalom.
Exactly. Exactly. But the other thing is also shal is a tree, like the
And
tree of
also a
life.
school, shala.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why everything is just dovetailing so perfectly. So I
Yeah.
hope you continue this, because this is going to help me as I help my students understand the connection.
All right. Well, we'll be in touch.
And then hopefully one day when I'm opening up, I'm going to do obviously Zoom classes, but I'd love to have you as a guest at some point, or we'll have to work that out. But
I'd love to. Thank you.
awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you,
All right.
Miriam.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe one last
Okay, last one, and then we'll wrap up here.
one thought or question. We know that Israelis have been mesmerized by India and are going there as almost as a must for quite some time now. And I'm wondering if some of it ties into this perhaps sense of connection or intrigue by some commonalities, or is it more the opposite, that it's so different that it's exotic?
I don't know. I mean, I guess everybody goes for their own reasons. I do think that we're both ancient civilizations, which is different than being a culture. A civilization is something which you have your own way of doing everything. There's an Indian mathematics, there's a Jewish gematria, right? We do our everything our own way because we've been around so long. We don't have the numbers that India does, but we're both ancient civilizations. We have similar histories of oppression by foreign invaders, and even though they don't have a diaspora, they do have this sense of being, oppressed. So I think we see some commonalities there. I think that just the fact that we were under British rule similarly, and the fact that it's cheap, right? And Israelis have a very high tolerance for balagan, and India has a lot of balagan, a lot of chaos, for better or worse. And Israelis more than most. Like you just have to walk through a market in Israel and you feel like you're in India, right? So it's not as overwhelming for Israelis as I think it is like for, someone from Switzerland, drops into Delhi. An Israeli could deal with these things in a way and has no problem, because we're also products of the East to an extent, right? We're Asians, even though we don't think of ourselves that way, right? We're born in Asia. Right? I love in India, when they talk about the 6-Day War, what's the 6-Day War called in India? It's called the 1967 West Asian conflict, right?
Really?
Yeah, we're in West Asia, right? So it's the West Asian conflict, which is correct, right? It was a conflict that happened in West Asia. And so we don't think of ourselves that way, but we are in some ways, and I think that makes it really comfortable. And perhaps, a lot of Israelis are spiritually seeking, especially after the army, after their experiences in the army. They're looking for something. They're looking, and India kind of has always promised enlightenment to those who seek, right? And so they go there, some of them, take drugs, some of them study religious things, and some of them, just go to have fun and, for cheap. But I think that's part of it. But we have some kind of a deep bond for sure. That's why I put the word Hodi and Yehudi at the end, right? We're different but similar in some ways.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you, everybody. You can write to me at my email, or email is the best way. Otherwise, you can. I'm trying to think what other ways. WhatsApp, those things. My card, if you took a picture of my card that I showed, it has all that information on it. So I can bring that back if you haven't seen it. Oop, here's the card. So you have my phone number, my email, and I also have Facebook page, and I also am doing a podcast called Tour Guide Confidential. You're welcome.
You need to share your screen so we can see your card.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Where is that? Right here, share screen. Here we go. And now I'll make that large.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, let me make that larger.
Press Shift and F5.
There we go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so you have my card, has my email, my phone number. You can WhatsApp me. And also, as I said, I've got this podcast. So if you want to check it out, tourguideconfidential.com, or you can just go to Spotify or iTunes, all those places. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Namaste and
Bye.
shalom.
Shalom.
And namaste.
Namaste too.
Yeah, Nama. Hashem and Nama means the same. There you go.
Yeah, that's true. Nama and Hashem, same name.
Hi, Susie.
Yes.
Today, it was wonderful.
Bye.
Susie, are you coming to Traverse City?
I'm closing
What?
this up.
Okay, bye-bye.
To-
Miriam,
Quick,
You guys talk.